Hey, this is Raul for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of having a chance to chat with the authors of the bass book, A Complete Illustrated History of Bass Guitars, Tony Bacon, and Barry Moorhouse. And for those of you that are starting, you will notice that Tony is the one person you see that's actually moving. There we go, that's Tony. And I've got a still up of Barry as we ran into a few technical difficulties, but a book of this caliber is so important that we felt we must press on and get this going so that our readership, yourselves, could hear more about this. So kind of starting from the beginning, the edition that I have here is actually the third edition of this book, the original being released in 1995. So this has been a 21-year project, and it's kind of ongoing. How did you guys come up with the idea of doing a bass book?
Well, I've been writing and publishing books for a few years. By the time that 95 came around, I started out writing for magazines in the kind of mid-70s and 80s. And then come the 90s, it doesn't always work in decades, but some things do, fortunately. Come the 90s, I got the opportunity to produce a book called The Ultimate Guitar Book. Very unprepossessing name. And that came out in 91. And Nigel Osborne, who I did the book with, he and I decided that we would start to publish our own books. So that's what happened. And we started with a couple of guitar titles. And being a bass player originally, I'd always wanted to write about the history of the bass because it hadn't been done. I thought it was potentially a really good story. I'd known Barry for a long time. We go back certainly to the 80s. And he and I hooked up and talked about it. And that's how this, actually, I had a problem. There we are. That's the first
edition.
Yeah. So it was a hardback originally, a little smaller format, but that's where it all began. That's about right, Barry, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Raul, my involvement was that, as Tony had said, he was the writer, and we we had started in the mid-'80s. In the beginning of '84, we'd started essentially the first high-profile bass guitar only store in the world, possibly. And that started out in London, and we ended up by the mid-'90s with shops in Birmingham, Manchester, and Los Angeles. And so we had a different type of bass experience to Tony, but putting our experiences together and his knowledge meant that I think we were a reasonable force to be able to document that history.
And I think it's very exciting at multiple points. Number one, electric bass is a relatively young instrument when you look at, in comparison to so many of the classical instruments. I mean, the upright bass has been around for a way longer time, but we are living during this time, this early time in history. And I didn't know if you knew, but Bass Musician Magazine is in the process, it's ongoing, we started in January, of celebrating the year of the luthier. And as I look at the evolution of the electric bass as an instrument, it's kind of a tripod of factors that have influenced this progression. One of those being the initial inventive spirit with Leo Fender. I know Paul Tutmark doesn't get as much credit, perhaps. I've actually had the great honor of holding one of Tootmark's basses and getting a closer look at it, but it's rather an obscure branch off of the tree. And then another factor being that of industry and business, how it has made the evolution of the instrument progress. And then thirdly, the needs and the requirements of the music itself, which has lent itself. And all of these had to overlap in order for this growth and this progress to happen. And so as we are living through this time in history, to be able to document it, it's perfect because it's ongoing. But by the same token, as you look at the early years and when the first book was done, how has, like, now this is the third edition, how I'm sure the book itself has had to evolve. How has that happened?
Well, yeah, it has evolved. I mean, not just in the look of it. I mean, you held up the other edition, but
yes, I have the new one.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I put them side by side, I mean, you can see that the size has changed somewhat,
Sure.
And format has changed a little bit. But I think we wanted to when we did the first edition, it was kind of uncharted territory in some ways. I mean, obviously there had been other books about the guitar, kind of often put the bass in as a footnote. And it's like, oh, and Leo also made a precision bass. Let's move on to the Strat. You know? Yes. And Barry and I both found that a bit frustrating, and we wanted to put that right, really. But we also, I think you make a good point about the development being in the hands of players. We really wanted to show how players had influenced the story all the way along the line. That's what you would expect, I suppose, but it doesn't always happen with other instruments. You know, I think there's sometimes there can be a kind of a split in the road, and a maker will go one way and players will go another way, and then suddenly the maker will go, hold on, we're going adrift here. Fender has done it in its history; it's gone adrift. Players have said, well, actually, no, what you really need to be doing is this, and pull them back onto course. So we really wanted to show how that story had how the two had interlinked, really, the story of the makers and the story of the players, and how that was sometimes harmonious and sometimes wasn't, you know, and with different results because of that.
I think also, you'll have to forgive me if I jump in at any time incorrectly, because I can't see anybody. I think the point that you made, Raul, which is being answered by Tony, also the point that you made that it's a relatively young instrument. So what was very interesting for Tony and I was the fact that we were able to call on some of these people who'd been involved with Leo in the early days. I went over to where literally Leo worked at the end of his career when we took a photographer over to the States. And interestingly enough, we did have the displeasure of coming together on several occasions when somebody had died.
Oh, no.
And this is an awful thing to say, but I'm just trying to amplify the fact that all these guys, a lot of them were still around. So we were able to record this history from 95 onwards in real time, essentially, with interviews with a lot of people. Would you agree with that, Tony?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we felt that we wanted to speak to as many people as we could, but obviously you have to be selective. And that kind of, it's a limitation, but it's also an opportunity, I think. I mean, certainly amongst the players, we were very lucky to get Paul McCartney to speak to us. I mean, and that was, I contacted a number of people with the idea of interviewing, and I thought, well, I'd give McCartney a shot, and I didn't for a minute think that we would actually get to him, but we did. I don't know, maybe he just got out of bed the right way that morning. Who knows? Who knows what happens in the world of Paul McCartney? But sure. I was told by somebody at his office, actually, that he did the interview because he likes to be. He's much more likely to do something where he's seen amongst his peers. He's not so keen on being it sounds odd to say about Paul McCartney, but he's not so keen to be seen as the focus. He's very keen to be seen as the focus in other circumstances.
Yes.
But he likes to be seen amongst his peers, and certainly we underlined that would be the case. He was a very important part, I think, of the history of bass. Certainly pointed the direction for a lot of people that followed, and underlined the fact that the bass guitar is a very it's a very seductive instrument, and it's but used properly, it can change the course of a piece of music. And he said in the interview, you suddenly, when you start playing, you suddenly realise the power that you have as a bass player. And he said it's not vengeful power, or at least he wasn't using it that way. It's just the power that you have and you recognise and you use appropriately. So that was when we were doing the first edition of the book, that was absolutely the high spot when we went down to McCartney's studio and spent 2 or 3 hours with him. And we sat down and I said, I'm going to have to ask this as the first question. Do you mind talking about the Beatles? Because remember, this was 95. I had no idea whether that was a good subject in his mind at that time or a bad subject or whatever. And he said, I love talking about the Beatles, carry on. And we did it for two or three months, and it was wonderful.
And equally, we were very fortunate to have access to the whole of John Entwistle's collection, who was a good mate. And so he basically said, just root through them all. And there's a lot of photographs of his instruments in the book, which I think is particularly apt in the fact that if you consider in the 60s, when there was McCartney was a strong force, most guys were playing root and fifth and having half that recorded wrongly, whereas Entwistle was playing solos on hit singles. He was so far ahead of his time. So if you consider that, some of the instruments and the input was from the likes of Pino Palladino, John Entwistle, Paul McCartney, there's a Brit influence, but let's be honest about it, that influence in the 60s, which came over to America, was where it all was very strong anyway in the beat boom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, that confluence, because that's where the way that music has evolved, especially with rock, that I think has brought the electric bass to the forefront, certainly as compared to like rockabilly or country western, where you could use an upright and certainly get the job done. I know that I myself changed. I used to play accordion in the early 60s, and when the Beatles came out, it was put away because, okay, no, we cannot do Beatles music on the accordion. And I believe that just that musical influence, even without just the bass part, is a big part of what has created this evolution. Even with that, the ratio of guitars to basses, manufacturers are making 10 guitars for every bass that they make. We're still a great minority, but I think certainly it is greatly important for there to be something for us instead of a footnote, because I agree. I have gone through, usually it'll be a brand book, and you're right, there'll be a small chapter on whether it was the Gibson bass or whether it was, but also interestingly, it's been kind of a spirit of innovation where you don't see us all playing Hofners because Paul did. So there was some example there, but it also has had kind of a mind of its own and has been moving along. And now, one of the great debates that we see on our social media pages is the issue of more than 4 strings. My bass brethren, get rabid and tend to howl and bark whenever they see more than 4 strings. They're tolerant of 5, but when it comes to extended range and things, they're getting just very excited. And these are areas where the instrument is growing in uncharted waters, where some of them will go, "Oh, that's a harp. That's not a bass anymore." As the book evolved, I know we build on the past, but as you're seeing the trends, how do you see the future of bass going? What predictions, what thoughts do you have?
Well,
yeah, go on.
sorry. Yeah, Tony and I, when we were going to do the 3rd edition, sat down to have our first discussion on how it had progressed from the 2nd bout of writing, and basically we agreed that one has to have general trends. One can't talk about the odd guy who plays a 10-string or extended range and we were saying that actually in the last decade, in a lot of ways, the bass player has returned in relative anonymity to the back of the band. And because what happened over in the UK, strangely enough, after what I said about John Entwistle, that is, the instrument was brought to the forefront by the slapping era, and not necessarily the guys that were doing it in, like Marcus Miller or Lewis Johnson in the States. It was the fact that in England you had a band called Level 42 and Mark King, who were doing 6 or 8 nights at the Royal Albert Hall, chart-topping albums, hit singles, and the average guy in the street all of a sudden knew what a bass guitar was. And that's really what we found. That's why the Bass Centre was successful in the 80s. It was by no means because of our intent. It was completely fortuitous that this trend came along, got involved in popular music, and that's where it started. People then noticed the bass guitar. This then led on to 5 strings, 6 strings, extended range, blah, 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 blah. What we've found to the present day is that the 6-string bass is still specialist, as is 8, as is everything else. The 5-string is here to stay. That's in the requisite of the guy who goes in the studio. He's got to have a passive Fender instrument, probably an active 5. But other than that, the bass player has now retreated back again to the back of the band, often with a Fender bass, and is not as high profile as he was when we started out writing in the 1st edition. I don't know if Tony would agree with that completely, but I think we do.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I was going to say about the sort of 5 and 6 story was another thing that when we first looked at what we were going to write about, we thought, how actually did that come about? How did the 5 and 6 thing come about? So we talked to Anthony Jackson, and he talked at length, as Anthony does, about his role with quite a few makers really along the way. It's quite a complicated story. I remember that one being the one that I really had some trouble unraveling, really, and trying to tell in a coherent way, because it ducks and dives between different makers and different workshops, and wide spacing and narrow spacing and all the rest of it. The other guy was Jimmy Johnson, James Taylor, probably best known for, and he ordered a low B5 from Alembic pretty early on. So that it was great to find out things like that, where Barry and I just sat down and thought, what did happen? Nobody seems to have sorted this out. Or people had talked to those guys in isolation, but hadn't brought the whole story together and actually asked the question, how did those extended basses come about? What was the purpose of them, and are they relevant now? the musical purpose, as a friend of mine says. The question is always, what's the musical purpose? And I think, well, like we were saying earlier, if more makers had said that along the way, and said, what's the musical purpose? Well, we wouldn't have had so many oddities to put in the book. So that maybe it was good that they did. But again, a very interesting story, and one that I think, as Barry says, it's the 5 that has survived, and that's the one that really has become, for many players, an essential alongside the 4.
As Tony has alluded to, that's, as he said, that's the 5 with the low B, as opposed to its predecessor, the 5 with the high C, which was just a 15-fret reading guitar to read dots with. So obviously it did exist before. But Tony, it's a very good point. Who's laying claim to actually that low B usage? And it was really intriguing, exactly as Tony said, how many people lay claim to that, actually.
Well, and I've had the opportunity to interview some bassists that have actually adapted a low B, but they're staying with 4 strings. And part of that had to do with neck width and hand size. So just the physicality of it. But as we move on, also in the evolution of the instrument, areas, I kind of see a main flow where many manufacturers are following, and I'm doing air quotes here, Barry, I know you can't see them, in a Fender way. And so many manufacturers will make something and you kind of go, wow, that looks an awful like a Fender, but it's not. And they've done tweaks to it, they've changed some things, but unless you take a microscope and look closely, you can't really tell that it's not a Fender. That said, there are kind of at the far edges of our evolutionary tree, builders and luthiers that are kind of pushing the envelope, looking for alternatives, whether it be the materials that they're building with. So we've seen Arium bases out of the Netherlands. It's a synthetic resin that's supposed to have a molecular structure similar to wood. It is milled out of one solid block, so there's no parts. We've seen aluminum bases in combinations of the whole instrument. I saw some at the last NAMM show. There were some with aluminum necks that we were seeing in the past. Carbon fiber in necks. I know it seems like a lot of these will come to the forefront and be no more than a fad. While we still have wood, which is still a choice of excellence for everybody. Kind of looking ahead, do you think that there will be a lot of changes in the future, or are these just kind of experimental trends, like trying different food or something?
Raul, if I could jump in on this, Raul.
Sure.
We made reference to, and Tony and I sat down when we wrote the first book, exactly with reference to what you're talking about, that one guy was looking at all these alternatives and made a huge impact in the industries, Ned Steinberger. Mm-hmm. And people look at Ned Steinberger and perhaps think of him for one difference in design, but he essentially developed and he instigated headless design, a lack of a body, double ball end stringing, and he basically covered so many of the different options all at once, because he was a furniture designer and not a musician who was, as you say, Fender orientated. Mm-hmm. I laugh to this day that anybody with a slight inclination for guitar playing seems to be born with a DNA that includes a DuPont car color chart, and they sort of, go ballistic as soon as they say seafoam green. Yeah. And he in my opinion, and Tony and I talked about this a lot, deserved a great deal of credit, because while Alembic were coming along with active electronics and coffee table finishes, the actual, not the shape, but the actual physicality of the instrument with the conventional headstock and tuners was always the same. And there were a lot of exotic builders starting to produce at that particular time. And when you consider that Ned Steinberger even designed the earliest Spectres with the curved body, he was doing all that before we even wrote the first edition. So with respect to all the chaps doing things now, carbon graphite's been around for years and years and years, which again, I think makes my point that the guy has returned to the back of the band. And this is why I said with a Fender bass. It's extraordinary what Leo got right. Yeah, absolutely.
It's true. I mean, and I think that's it would be nice if that wasn't the case, because there'd be more to write about. But we've
Be careful what you say here, Tony.
What my client means to say. I mean, we let's put it this way: we searched low to find new things to put in this third edition, and we certainly have, and we've updated it and we've improved the general look and feel of it. But it does come down to what Barry's saying, that I don't know how many times out of 10 it is, but however many times, that's the number that people are seeing with a Fender or a Fender alike. And I think those examples you were talking about, Raul, that different materials and so on, and different approaches, different electronics, whatever it might be, lights up and down the fingerboard, it kind of makes you want to pick up a P bass. It really does, and that's home for a lot of us. I think really, it just feels right.
That's very well said, Tony. It is home, because basically after everybody's had a Status or a Steinberger, or everybody's tried a carbon graphite, for some strange reason, as you quite rightly say, they always gravitate back to that 34-inch scale, 4 or 5 string, possibly the 35-inch scale. And Raul, this is it's almost as if 90% of people are just perfectly happy with that as a functioning instrument. Apropos the double bass, which is what it replaced in the first place.
I gotcha. Well, and there is certainly it's not an understatement to say that there's a definite love affair with bassists and their instruments. One of the things that we see also on our social media is the lamenting of loves lost. And a lot of times it's the musician is searching for that perfect bass, had that Fender, if they were lucky enough to get their hands on like a 1970 something P bass, but in search of like the Holy Grail, went to the pawn shop to get money to buy the next one up, and then has forever regretted ever having let go of the old one, to where now the manufacturers are making retro looking basses. And so, you can buy a brand new instrument with a 50s headstock because you weren't fortunate enough to be there to get that, one of the few that were made at the time. So it is a kind of a complete circle. And again, I know a lot of the luthiers that are pushing the envelope to make something different. They stand on the shoulders of that basic design and the characteristics that musicians look for. So again, I think certainly one of the most important things for our readership, if you play bass, you need to know your family history. You can't just wake up as an adult and go, I know nothing about my past or my family. It's tragic, like amnesia. So you very much need to get this book and get caught up and understand why you're even making some of the choices you're making today when you're migrating back to, a P base, or you're looking into this. So much ground has been covered, and we're extraordinarily grateful. I speak for the bass community in general, to Tony and Barry for being the bearers, the torch bearers of our history. It's kind of like Jesuit monks having this duty of recording for posterity.
We do see ourselves as Jesuit monks.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell that to someone in the pub tonight.
ask if they can see your halo or your aura, because it's such a vital task. But it could
You can see Barry's there, actually. Yeah.
There you go. It could have very easily happened if nobody was paying attention to write down the details. I guess it's like cavemen finally drawing on their walls so that people knew what they did. And so this is an essential thing. So definitely, Tony, Barry, thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedule to share your insight. Again, the bass book, A Complete Illustrated History of Bass Guitars. You play bass, this needs to be in your library. And very easy to find at a bookstore, online. You have no excuse for not having this book. Thank you very much, gentlemen. You've seen this live Skype interview. My friends here in the UK, here we are in the great Northwest in Portland. Bass Musician Magazine.